Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up, meaning we're live. If maybe Matt, you could pull the doors closed there. Good to see everybody. I'm sure you remember everything that we said 2 weeks ago when we started this class. Chocolate last week didn't cause you to forget everything. I don't want to, we're not going to go back too much over that. We'll hit a couple of things that we talked about just to reinforce them as we get into chapter 1 tonight. One of the things we talked about was how much there is out there in terms of theories about which Pharaoh it was and when it happened and all this kind of stuff. And you can start reading that stuff and your head hurts. Okay, the general date that most the scholars seem to come down on is between 1500 BC, and readily admit we don't know for sure, and we don't know for sure which Pharaoh it is, and there are people who are ready to die on a hill for a particular Pharaoh, a Ramesses or one of the Amenhoteps or one of the Tutmoses, and all these reasons about why this has to be the one, and they've all got their problems. And of course, we made the point that when you go through the book of Exodus, the book sort of makes a point of not naming the Pharaoh, and it means something. In general, it's almost disrespect for Pharaoh and what he claimed. That he's not named. When I started looking for a graphic for the slide, this was not my favorite. You know, when you think of, when I say Egypt and I say Exodus, you think of pictures of big walls of water and Moses, Charlton Heston as Moses holding up his staff and all those kinds of things, and pyramids and all that sort of stuff. Most folks do agree that the Israelites did not build the pyramids. All right, there are a lot of folks that believe that, but nobody who's done much study believes that. There's one of the very earliest of the step pyramids that some folks theorize that Joseph had something to do with it because it had to do with grain storage. Okay, but I did want to show you tonight. I did find some stuff about how the pyramids were built that. Almost didn't do it, but decided now we'll go ahead and do it. And that's, here's the folks slaving away building the pyramids, saying, well, this is great. It's going, this is not so bad. It's going to last forever, and people, will be remembered. The effort and skill that it took to build the pyramids. And so today, what do we have? Aliens definitely built these. Okay, so it didn't work. And then I found a slide of. Yeah, aliens built the pyramids. Okay, so that's how they pulled it off. We'll come back to this in a minute. One thing I do want you to remember from a couple of weeks ago is we sort of put together a list of the top 10 major events in the Old Testament. And the point we were trying to make is how that the Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai, which is in the book of Exodus, is really a pivotal point in the history of the Israelites, and certainly in the history and God's plan in sending the Messiah. And so what we're looking at here in Exodus is really, really important. But to get us started tonight, seeing those guys drag the blocks up the pyramids, what's the hardest job you ever had? Notice I didn't say the worst job you ever had. What's the hardest job you ever had? Parent. What's that? Parenting. I'm sorry. I got a. Parenting. Okay. Yeah.
That's not a job at all.
Okay.
Well, if you're talking about physical labor, for me it would have been helping my brother build the boardwalk and observation tower at Lettuce Lake.
Okay. All right. Back there, Daryl.
One of the roughly when I was working delivering debt messages,
delivering death messages. That would be a hard job. Not physically taxing, other than stress. Certainly some physical stress there. Anybody else got a hard job? Teese.
Working in tenant night to 6:30 in the morning in a factory that OSHA never found.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yes, Renee.
Every summer they would have jobs for children based on income. So after everybody got their job, my daddy would always ask the man at the city, is there another job? So they gave me a job as a binder's helper at NAS Pensacola. And it meant you had to catch all these training manuals and put, for each naval base all over and there was this man there that they said, you won't survive because Asa runs everybody off. Every time we get a woman back here, he'd run, and I was in like 11th and 12th grade. So Asa Lowry, who was the boss of the binders. So every time I get a big box of books, to send to Jackson or whatever, I'd say, you need to move that because I'm going to have babies one day and I can't pick that box up. And he would pick it up for me, and they called and told my daddy, Renee has tamed Asa. So, but I wasn't picking up that, but I wanted the job because it was a good job, but I wasn't picking up that stuff. So I told him, I said, I can't do that. I'm going to get married and have children one day.
So Renee said, challenge accepted. Okay, all right. I don't think I've told this story before, and if I have, I'm sorry. I know I've told it to my small group at least once. But probably the hardest job I ever had was when I think I was 14 or 15 years old. We had been living in the house that we were in for about 10 years. We had a gravel driveway. And my dad decided, well, it's time for us to finally pave the driveway. But I don't want to use asphalt. I want to concrete it because it's gonna last longer. And so our house was such that there was a carport on the end of it, and the drive came up, and you pulled into the carport, and you could pull out the back of the carport and go down the back and around the hill, and there was a big flat spot where the garage was. We were built on a hill. And so he had to tie new concrete into existing concrete. But when you do that, you have to put some reinforcement in there so that the concrete doesn't settle. So my dad came to me and says, well, here's what I want you to do this summer is, carport's about 24 feet wide. Every 2 feet, I need to stick a metal dowel in about 6 inches into this concrete, and it'll stick out 6 inches, and when I pour the concrete, it's going to match up. I want you to drill the holes. Okay, anybody in here know what a star drill is? Anybody ever used a star drill? Okay, it's basically a chisel about as big around as my finger, and the end of it is like a Phillips head screwdriver. Okay, so I had a star drill, a small sledgehammer, not power. I had to do these by hand. So I'm down on my knees every 2 feet, hand drilling a 6-inch hole into existing concrete up one side of the carport and down the other. But he promised me, he said, if you do this, we'll pour that concrete around the back by the garage and I'll get you a basketball goal. So I said, okay, it's worth it. And so I spent the summer on my knees, drilling holes by hand into existing concrete. I still, as I think back about it, how did I ever do that? Okay. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, where are the Israelites when we open the book of Exodus? What are they doing? They're making bricks, okay? Well, actually, when we open the book, we'll go there in a minute and read, but ultimately tonight, we're going to get to the Israelites being oppressed, okay? And we're going to see in the verses that we read, multiple times it talks about oppression, and it talks about the Israelites being dealt with ruthlessly. We really don't have an idea, I don't think, about how hard that was, okay? As hard as it was me drilling holes by hand into existing concrete, hey, I could take a break when I wanted to. I could go inside where it was air conditioned and I could rest a little bit and then come back. There was nobody with a whip. There was nobody beating me. And here by the time we get to the end of this chapter, the Israelites are in severe trouble. Okay? They've known nothing but this. Everybody that came from up in where Jacob was, they've all died. And so for generations, all they've known is a life. You do what you're told, when you're told, how you're told, as long as you're told. Then you go home and you get up and you do it again. Okay? And so I went through sort of this exercise. It's good for us to realize that when we talk about Israel being oppressed and needing to be redeemed by God, it really was a redemption that was needed. It was not just, they wanted to live on the beach, but they're living up in the mountains instead. It wasn't that kind of situation at all. That's a painting by a guy named Pointer from about 1867, where he's trying to depict the Israelites in slavery. I don't think it's accurate at all, but it's about the only, in the spirit of Tim, it's about the only famous painting that comes up when you start looking for the Israelites in slavery. Otherwise, you get sort of some cheesy Sunday school material that probably isn't realistic either. This is a screen capture of Google Maps from this afternoon. What strikes you about that picture? Matt?
Is basically all desert.
Okay, except for?
The area around the Nile.
The area around the Nile. Just the contrast between how green the delta and then on down the course of the Nile is just really stark. If you see up there sort of at 4 o'clock, if you look at the big blob up at the top and you see sort of kind of at 4 o'clock an area that's kind of gray, that's the land of Goshen. That's where the Israelites were. Only it wasn't gray back then. It was as green. In fact, it was described as the most fertile place in the land. Seems a little bit, maybe not ironic, but justifiably so, that area is not so fertile now that Israel is not there anymore. But just the contrast that's there and the dependence that the Egyptians have on the Nile plays into when we start talking about the plagues. The other thing that comes up here is when one of the reasons that there's difficulty identifying which Pharaoh it is and some of the historical things that were happening around it is there were other folks from Canaan either before or during the time that Jacob and his family moved down from up in Canaan that came into this area. And they were warlike. The Hyksos, and there was a period of time in Egypt where there was more than one pharaoh, and there was war going on and lots of dispute and fighting over that strip of green that's there. And it kind of it'll play a little bit into the discussion tonight when we get into the verses. I thought that was kind of interesting. All right, let's go to chapter 1. I didn't tell you 2 weeks ago, but I do encourage you to bring a Bible, whether it's the paper kind or on your phone, because I do not promise that I will do this every week. It's a lot of work, okay? But tonight we're going to get through the first chapter. But it starts out, and Exodus is really part 2 of Genesis. It's a continuation of Genesis. If we went back and looked at the end of the book of Genesis, you'll see that it talks about the death of Joseph, and they're all down in Egypt, and this just picks right up. In fact, rabbis called this book, they didn't call it Exodus, they called it Names, because that's what the text starts with. It starts with names. This is the book of names. So let's read. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. and Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. When we get to the actual Exodus and them leaving, lots of speculation about that. We're told some of the numbers in the scripture. And the reality is, by the time they leave, it could have been a crowd as big as 2 million people. Okay, we're not talking about, a few hundred or a few thousand. We're talking about lots of folks, exceedingly fruitful, it says. Well, it says, then a new king, notice, doesn't even call him Pharaoh, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal out shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. First off, we've got a king to whom Joseph means nothing. How could that happen? How could a king rise? As much impact as Joseph had on basically saving the nation of Egypt during the famine, how could a king rise? Joseph didn't mean anything to him. What do you think? Okay, time had passed. Okay, Matt, you were going to say something? Just time had passed. Jeannie.
Worked for a client for 10 years. A very good client, and he liked working with him, and the man died. And the man that replaced him in the business didn't know Bert and got somebody else that he liked, that he knew in that position. So that
Okay.
happens.
We forget, okay?
Same way with leadership changes here and now. They have no loyalties to
Okay.
whoever served under them before.
Okay. We forget really quickly. I having worked in municipal government for a number of years, I could throw out names that you guys have never heard of. That you are impacted by the things that they did when they were in office or serving. We just forget quickly. And particularly if this is a period of time when Egypt is struggling internally to deal with its own governing, I got other things on my mind. I got troubles I got to deal with. And in fact, I thought this last phrase, if war breaks, we'll join our enemies. I've always kind of had the concept that they were afraid that Israel would just overrun them themselves. Doesn't sound like they were really afraid of that. They were afraid, those folks, they've just been slaves for us. They don't have any weapons. They don't have any organization. But there's just so many of them, these folks that we're struggling with internally to try to deal with the country, they'll make a faction with them, and then we will be in trouble because they'll arm them, they'll set them up, and we'll have trouble. So he says if war breaks, they'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Okay?
This also sounds like it's coming from someone who's incredibly paranoid
Okay?
and is concerned with self-preservation.
Okay.
He automatically goes to whatever the worst case possible scenario is and the most extreme way to deal with that.
Okay. I'm not sure that's that different in dealing with people in political positions and power now. I got in, I want to stay in, and I'm going to, anything that I think is threatening me, well, I want to make it a big problem. We're going to deal with it. Okay? All right. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Okay? We're going to read about the economic benefit. In fact, even in the previous slides, they may leave the country and we're going to lose this resource. We're going to read that sort of fear several times, but a big part of what they're doing is not just the economic benefit to start with, it's to keep them in line. put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Okay? And they called them slave masters, not, okay, they've got unions, we're gonna put some bosses in there, and, we'll have to negotiate benefits, and no, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Okay, that's, I think, 2 or 3 times we see the word oppress, and a couple of times we see the word ruthless. Again, this is not me drilling holes on my knees in the summer to get a basketball goal. Okay, this was slave labor. Okay, and slave labor long enough that nobody that's alive among the Israelites remembers anything else. Okay, we're talking 400 years. Okay, generations. My parents and my grandparents. That's all that we've known. Why did God allow that? Seems like after all that, the faith of Abraham and all the stuff, that has gone on, and all the tremendous promises that God has made, why would he let that happen? What do you think?
They abandoned the promised land.
Okay, hang on.
It seems that the people forgot about God. They were doing their own thing. So this was one way that they would have to rely on God to pull them out. They did not remember who had brought them so far, or they chose to forget.
Okay. Well, we'll come back and spin off of some of that in a minute. Jim, and then Phil, who couldn't wait.
If you're willing to accept it, it's a story, true story, but God is building a story of deliverance.
Okay.
And to be delivered, you have to be delivered from something.
Okay.
And it's very much parallel to our own personal stories.
Okay. Phil,
They abandoned the promised land.
were they told not to do that?
Well, I don't remember that, but I'm sure they were.
I don't think Scripture told them not to go down there. In fact, if you look at it, one way of looking at this, if you look at all of the things that had to happen to get Joseph to Egypt and the things that he went through to get into a position of power, it's almost like that was the plan. Okay. So, but they did leave. All right, Renee.
And after all of this time, the Egyptians' economy was based on slave labor. And people don't usually give up that luxury very easily. You look what happened in the United States to give up slave labor. 250,000 people died in the Civil War. So they, after a while, that's all they knew.
Okay.
And certainly the Egyptians weren't going to say, well, y'all can just go on back home now, it'll be fine.
Okay.
Their economy was based on slave labor.
Okay. Why did God want that though, Matt?
Well, he was allowing the people already in the promised land to build up their own level of judgment. And then at that point, God would move them out.
Okay.
As
Matt's read chapter 2. Okay. Which we'll come to in a minute. Jeannie?
When people go through different living proof is what they lived. they started grumbling after they were out, and all of a sudden they forgot how bad Egypt was, and they longed for the leeks, and they
Okay.
longed for, and God, I guess God had to make it bad enough that they wouldn't want to go back.
Okay, all right. Well, you're up a few chapters before. It's difficult for us, isn't it? When we look at how tough it was and how long it was tough on them after all of the great promises that God had made to Abraham, it's tough for us to get a handle on, well, you know, why did God do it this way? Why did he allow that to happen? Did God need to practice and build up power to get strong enough to bring them out of Egypt? You know, that certainly was not the issue. Okay?
Well, I tend to think that the Jews, the Israelites, were not praying. They were not praying.
Well, it's interesting. We're gonna read. Well, we're gonna read that God says, "I heard their crying." So there was some level of remembrance of what God had promised. Okay, and when Moses shows up and says, "You know, I'm here. You know, God's heard your crying, and it's time. He's going to bring you out." There's some level of that. We also read that some of them adopted the Egyptian gods while they were there. Okay, so you know there was some remembering and there was some forgetting, but it seemed at the heart of it they still knew which son of Jacob they belonged to. They kept the lineages, and with that keeping of the lineage, knew that they were descendants of Jacob, who was a descendant of Isaac, who was a descendant of Abraham, that God had promised this land that we used to live in to bring us back. So there was some level of remembering. Law hasn't been given, so they're not doing, you know, the sacrifices of the law. We don't know exactly, you know, what they were doing there. I don't know, you know, why God chooses to do some of the things that he does, but it seems like there's some themes that turn up over and over again about how things occur. And one of those themes is that he never does it the way that we would do it if we were in charge. Just doesn't. He picks the person and the people that are lesser, not greater. He takes that's weak and makes it strong. Okay? We see that theme over and over. And another theme that we see is he does things in a way so that after it's done, nobody else can take credit. That sort of gets to what Jim was talking about. Okay? That nobody else can take credit. That God has done this. And to me personally, I think that is a big part of this. Because all the way through the story leading up to the Messiah, it's God is doing this. When there's a victory, God is the one who delivers. When he uses somebody in a mighty way, we learn about their weaknesses, and the only way that God accomplished what he accomplished through them was, well, it was God doing it. So after 400 years and generations, there's no way that Israel can come out and say, look what we did. We finally got tired of this stuff, and we kicked the doors down, and we just we don't take this job and, you know, the song. You know, no way they could say that. Helpless, unorganized, no way that they could come out, become the powerful nation that they became later, and say that, well, yeah, we knew this stuff all along. We knew how to be a people. They didn't know how to be people. They knew how to go out and make bricks when they were told to, okay, and go home and come back and do it again. And so God is putting them in a position so that when they're redeemed, and that really is the theme of Exodus, is redemption. When they're redeemed by God, they are truly redeemed, and they are redeemed only by his grace and his action. I'm sure there's other things that he had in mind that, you know, we don't get. But I think those are two very powerful lessons for us when we look at our own lives and things that happen, and we wonder, well, why are things happening? So they are being worked ruthlessly. Well, the king of Egypt, okay, still call him the king. Eventually they're going to call him nothing but Pharaoh. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah. Okay, we're never told the name of Pharaoh, but we know a few thousand years later, Shiphrah and Puah, we know their names. I think that's intentional. Okay? Again, there is no respect for Pharaoh and who he claims to be, and the resistance and the hard-heartedness that he's going to have, and the way that he treated God's people. We're not even going to remember your name. In fact, it's going to be so confusing that scholars are going to argue about which one it is. But we're going to know Shiphrah and Puah. Who were they? Hebrew midwives. Okay. It's interesting, there's a lot of discussion about whether Shiphrah and Puah were really Hebrew or not. Okay? I do not speak Hebrew, but folks who do speak Hebrew say that you can translate Hebrew midwives either Hebrew midwives, which is they're Hebrew and they're midwives, or it's likewise an accurate translation to say the midwives of the Hebrews, and suggest that perhaps they were Egyptian. One of the reasons that folks want to go that way is they have a hard time imagining Pharaoh calling Hebrews into his presence to talk to them. I personally don't have a problem with that. If I'm in charge and I'm in dread of the Israelites, and I'm the boss, and I can call two women that I'm not afraid of in front of me because I want them to do something they don't want to do, I don't have any problem with making them grovel in front of me. But by the same token, if they're really Egyptians who are serving as midwives to the Hebrews, call them into and say, here's what I want you to do. Okay? Yeah.
I also find it easier to believe that a Hebrew would fear God more than Pharaoh.
Okay, that's another aspect of this. It's interesting, we will see as we go through this, not so much now, but as we get on into the plagues, we're going to see there are some Egyptians who come to respect and understand that their Pharaoh's getting his butt kicked. Okay? So much so that some of them leave with the Israelites when it's time to leave. Okay? So, however it is, Pharaoh calls these folks in, or at least in this first contact, if he sends somebody to go tell them something, Pharaoh says, do this, that's the same as Pharaoh telling them. Okay? So don't get too hung up about that. But he says, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby's a boy, kill him. But if he's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? If there's anything for me that's hard for me to understand is why he didn't call them in and punish them. Okay? But at any rate, they fear God. This is not a right thing to do, and so we're not going to do it. Well, the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives arrive, okay? Pharaoh's just a guy. He's not even going into the delivery room at this point, so, he doesn't know anything, okay? So they give him a story. And as a result of this, God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Okay. which again, if they're Egyptian midwives of the Hebrews, their children are not in any danger. Okay, so, I don't know. Well, Pharaoh gave this order to all the people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw in the Nile, but let every girl live. We get our first glimpse at the real evil of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is not a nice dude, and we're going to talk more about this hardening of heart and all this kind of stuff, but at his core, Pharaoh's evil. Okay? He's ruthless. And why didn't they kill the girls? Why did they just kill the boys and not the girls?
Well, not even looking at any nefarious thing that they might want to do afterwards with the girls. It's a matter of economics. They breed the labor,
Okay.
so they have to keep the machine going.
Okay,
And
but they're killing the labor when it's being born. So
Well, somehow they are going to, when they
Okay.
come to a realization that they
Okay.
have the situation controlled, and now they don't have to fear the number
Okay.
of males, they will need the labor. So
Okay. All right. Good point. Got Tyler back here.
Well, I'm sort of thinking that they were sort of seeing it like when you're like trimming a plant, cutting off some parts of it, because you still want to have the plant there, but you don't want it to get too big. So they're trimming off like specific parts of it to control its size, but
Okay.
without cutting off everything to kill the plant
Okay.
completely.
Okay.
I mean, a disturbing analogy, but it's a disturbing thing they're doing. So.
Okay. All right, Renee over here.
If there was going to be a rebellion, it would be a rebellion of men fighting.
Yes. Okay. I think that's a big part of it. Is there not still today a big imbalance in the Mideast between the number of boys and the number of women? Okay. Going back to what Casman was talking about, the ability to have females who could bear children was an issue. Okay. And so sparing the female, gave them a potential resource when they did want reproduction. Okay. Jim?
I was going to say basically what Renee said, but also add that possibly, I mean, I don't know this for certain, but possibly they saw the women not only as a lesser threat, but they could control their offspring. They could bring them into the Egyptian fold to have at least half children who are half Egyptian and not fully Hebrew, and mold them or incorporate them into their society.
Okay.
I don't know. That's just a possibility.
At any rate, we get to the end of chapter 1. The Israelites have been in Egypt going on 400 years. They've known nothing but oppression and ruthlessness, and it's gotten worse. Hadn't gotten better, it's gotten worse because now murder's on the table. Okay? And we'll pick up there next week with our good friend Moses. I guess we got a couple minutes. What do you take away from this first chapter?
It's almost kind of interesting.
Wait just a second.
You asked the question earlier, why did God allow this to happen? But it's almost interesting, the more that they are oppressed, the more he continues to bless them, which continues the more oppression, because he continues to let them, they're growing in numbers, and it's just adding to the oppression. So
Does God not know what he's going to do at this point? He knows what he's going to do. Okay, and so he's bringing it to the point, and Matt made a point earlier, and we'll probably hit it next week, is God tells Moses, he says, I've heard my people. Okay, I haven't forgotten. But there's some really wicked people up in the place where they're going. I'm giving them some time as well. But they're going to reach a point where it's time for their judgment. And so this is all part of a plan, Moses. I'm in control. I know what I'm doing. And we'll see that next week in chapter 2. Yeah, Tim.
Every time people share examples of when this person sinned and God blessed them, these midwives are always brought up. These women who lied to Pharaoh and God blessed them. I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about population explosion. This is a covenant fulfillment in place.
Okay.
You know, that promise to Abraham is being fulfilled in real time here as this population is growing and they're being made into a great people.
Okay. Yeah, when we get a little further in and our Israelites are griping and complaining, okay, we always point to them and kind of feel good about ourselves. You can't, neither using these women as an excuse to lie in a situation or the Israelites as well, they grumbled, so a little bit of grumbling is okay. You know, we can't do that. Okay. Any other thoughts, takeaways? Jeannie.
God's feelings on human life were made known here in scriptures that we in the United States need to pay attention to.
Really, from time immemorial, the taking of life has been serious to God. If you look at when we read about Noah, for example, we always zero in on the phrase that says, you know, all of the thoughts of the heart were evil continually, and we point to that, and that's why God destroyed the world in a flood. But if you read the verses before that, really from Cain on up to there, the stuff the really, really bad stuff that was going on there is that human life became worthless. And I think it was Cain that sat back and said, you know, you do something to me, I'm going to do it to you sevenfold. You know, and the taking of life and the murder of life, it just goes all the way back, and it's a serious thing. Okay, good point. Yeah, Mark.
Human leaders with unchecked power often yield terrible results.
Okay.
And that's something we're seeing then. That's something we're seeing all through history.
Okay. In Pharaoh's case, he was the visible incarnation of one of their gods. Okay. So, yes.
You know, along that same point, one of the things that stuck out for me, it says that in verse 8, it said, then a new king who did not know about Joseph, came into power. And basically, this was a guy that came into power that didn't know the history of what was going on. That was huge, very much like what he is saying, so there are implications from that.
Okay. Anybody else? Thanks for your comments, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. I'm going to try to do a chapter a week, so if you'll read through the second chapter. This first 5 or 6 chapters, when we went through it with my small group, really altered my understanding and my sort of envisioning of what Moses was like. And as we go through, we'll see if that doesn't happen in here as well. Let's pray together to close. God, we thank you for being our Father, for the many and precious and great promises that you have made to us. We thank you for providing redemption for us. Pray that as we study this book and we see you redeeming your people, that we remember that we've been redeemed. Help us to learn the lessons from them and from your word that would help us to trust you more. just pray that you'll help us in times of difficulty, in times when we're wondering why things are happening the way they are, just to remember that you're in control, that you're God, and that you have saved us. Please watch over us now as we leave. Take us home safely. Bless our day tomorrow and our example and our words, the folks that we're around. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen.